Hello, and thank you for the beautiful introduction. It is an honor to be with you in this fifth annual conference organized by Project Witness. I am sorry that we don't have the pleasure of being all together in the same room as we were in the past, and God willing, we will have many opportunities in the future to do so. So I titled my lecture today Inanimate Survivors, and it will be our opportunity to talk about sentimental objects from life before and during the Holocaust and their meaning in our families. So I would like to start by sharing with you a quote by a psychologist called Ernest Dichter, who said in 1964, "Hollow hands clasp ludicrous possessions because they are links in the chain of life. If it breaks, they are truly lost." And Dichter himself was a young Jewish Holocaust immigrant who left Europe just before the Holocaust. And interestingly and relevant to our conversation, he actually made his career and has become known as the father consumer psychology. So the psychology that addresses the meaning of objects and why we buy them. So in our families of Holocaust survivors, we often have only fragments, only very few details about the lives of the people that our parents knew and about the way of life which they were deprived of when they became survivors. And Susan Jacobowitz, in her doctoral dissertation, said a beautiful sentence. She said, "Our parents are like the survivors of a shipwreck who washed up naked on their new land." And because most survivors, except for those who left Europe before it became impossible, most survivors lived in the concentration camps, in the woods, in hiding, and were not at all able to keep any heirloom or even any object from their homes in those conditions. Because of that, there is a dearth of artifacts in our families, and the absence of these objects is another aspect of the loss and the terrible destruction of our families and our communities, their homes, their way of life, all of that which has been erased and robbed of our parents. Many of us, second generation, feel very much the painful absence of these objects because of the loss of the connective power of objects. No objects means no tangible link to the past made real, as it was said, through the objects that were actually a part of that past. So let's talk for a moment about family memory in general in offspring of Holocaust survivors. So I would like to highlight that there is a very special role for the knowledge of the Holocaust in our experience, the second generation and the descendants of survivors. The knowledge of the Holocaust in the experience of children of survivors is a knowledge of something that actually happened before we were born. And it is not a knowledge of facts and historical data. It's a knowledge of emotional, traumatic things that happened, and the transmission of these emotions through the relationship with the parents via all kinds of implicit and explicit daily interactions in the life of the family. And the communication about the Holocaust is complicated in our families because of the impact of trauma on the survivors and on their ability to speak about the past, which is so painful and difficult. And the result of that very traumatic, painful difficulty speaking about these events is the erection in some families of what we call the double wall of silence, where parents could not speak about their experiences in the past, or did not want to speak about their experiences, feeling that this way they protect their children from a very destructive kind of knowledge of horrible things. And children who sensed on their part that it's a very painful and sensitive subject and did not want to ask parents about it because they didn't want to upset their parents, they didn't want their parents not to sleep well at night, and so they remained silent as well. And that was a sort of two-sided double wall of silence in some families. In other families, on the other hand, there was obsessive communication about the Holocaust, not suited to the developmental level of the children many times, so that even young children were exposed to very, very frightening, very disturbing fragments, and that was not at all necessarily an appropriate level of discussion. Both the way that parents spoke or did not speak about their experiences, and the emotional impact that any kind of fragment or story shared by the parents had on the children, resulted often in very disorganized and fragmented memories of the children of what they heard, what they were told. So we speak about holes in memory, or what I called the omnipresent absence in our families. Memory is a very complex process in general, and in trauma memory in particular, we have many, many elements that can lead to holes in memory, even in the memory of the survivors themselves. People who lived through a very traumatic event sometimes have difficulty in the moment when the terrible things are happening. The shock prevents the mind from actually registering appropriately what is happening, leading to inability to remember something because it was actually never registered properly. We sometimes have difficulties encoding in memory what happened when it's so traumatic, and we often have difficulties retrieving memories when they're very, very painful. Because of all of these things, even people who survived the terrible experience themselves can have what we call traumatic amnesia, or holes in what they remember and what they don't remember about these events. Even good memories of life before the Holocaust can be very, very suffused with pain for survivors because of the terrible way in which it ended. And so even those good pieces about what the family was like, what family life was like, are often not shared with the second generation because it's so painful to talk about it. And even that leaves a lot untold, a void that can only be filled to some extent by one's own imagination as a second generation. So for the children of survivors, the absence of knowledge about the past operates not as a void that we just don't even know we have, but rather as a very powerful absence, more like a psychic or a psychological black hole, so to speak, a hole that sucks in a lot of mental energy, that evokes a lot of interest and a need to know more. For second generation, on the other hand, also because of the fact that a lot of that void needs to be filled by sometimes one's own imagination about what it must have been like, we sometimes don't know for sure if our so-called memories about what happened to our parents or about what we were told are real or actually figments of our own imagination or an illusion that we created. So my very dear friend and mentor from Yale University, Dory Laub, himself a child of survivors, spoke about knowing and not knowing trauma, which is, as I expressed about the survivors themselves, it's often the result of the problems in memories that are extremely shocking and extremely painful. And in the second generation, it's that sense of knowing and not knowing, which I just described, that leads to what Nina Fisher called memory work, that urge to know more, to learn more about the people that lived before us in our family. And memory work is not a pathological symptom. It is a natural human need, human activity, human wish to connect with and explore and learn more about the past of one's family and previous generations in the family, to be able to establish some connection between who I am and who they were, and in which way I'm similar and in which way I'm like somebody else, and all of these things which are part of our own identity. Memory work seeks that kind of connection with what was called again by Marianne Hirsch and Nina Fisher a usable past. So elements that will be meaningful to us in establishing how we are like, how we are connected to the people before us, what about their values and traits and ways of life and choices might be relevant to who we are today and the choices that we make today. And that kind of a connection seeks to replace the void or the non-memory or the absence that is so potently present in our family's life because of the Holocaust. And in our case, in the case of Holocaust families, memory work has two different sort of emphases. One is learning more about life and our parents' experiences during the Holocaust, and the other one very much about the people and the life they led before the Holocaust. And I wanted to share with you a short piece from a quote from a poem by a very well-known Israeli poet, Yehuda Amichai, who also spoke about something very similar to the concept of memory work when he said, "And the migration of my parents has not subsided in me. Archaeology of the future, repositories of what was not, and the migration of my parents has not subsided in me." And he speaks about that absence, he speaks about that uprootedness and the repositories of what was not that we are seeking to establish connection with. And possessions become a very tangible part of family history. Possessions have always had a special place in the context of family histories in many cultures. And I will mention to you here a very lovely program that is on TV, on Netflix, for those of you who watch TV, called The Repair Shop, which is a small, beautiful workshop in England where a group of extremely skillful artisans repair objects of sentimental value that people bring to their workshop, and the people share why this object has such a sentimental value for them, and then these artisans skillfully return the objects to its prior glory and give it back to the people, and you can see how moving that experience is for those people when they get back this object repaired for them. Especially in the aftermath of violent trauma and the enormous break in continuity that happened in our families because of the Holocaust, inherited objects are incredibly meaningful, tangible links to earlier generations, and they can trigger very powerful memory work in our families, the attempt to connect with the people who used them, the people who made them, the people who kept them, how they were kept, and so forth. And there are some very interesting books that were the story based on the quest to find out more, triggered by a particular object that was found. One of them is the hair with the amber eyes. The other one is what they saved, pieces of a Jewish past. Under normal circumstances, in most societies, only luxury items were considered heirlooms, such as watches, jewelry, art, silver, and particularly expensive pieces of furniture. In our survivor families, any object, however trivial, from the pre-war past of the family might be taken as an heirloom. Any object that survived the Holocaust from the pre-war past is considered a precious heirloom by many of us. So when the object is actually still usable, such as a tablecloth or something else, we often use it with great care, very sparingly. We show it to friends. We make sure that our children know the significance of these seemingly inconsequential objects. And I would strongly recommend to all of you, at this time, the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust, actually hosts a current exhibition titled Ordinary Treasures. And I decided to share with you the few ordinary treasures that I have in my family, one of which is, or two of which are, the rolling pin that was made by my grandfather, who had a wood milling business, for his eldest daughter, my aunt Binka as we called her, for her to take with her because she was getting married and leaving Poland. So part of her nedunya was this rolling pin, which he made with his own hands, and this one tablecloth, which was a part of a large set of tablecloth and curtains and doilies that her younger sisters stitched for her, embroidered for her to take with her. These objects went from Poland with my aunt Binka to Austria, and then they fled from Austria to Palestine, and then when there was the War of Independence in Palestine, they came to the United States, and I got these objects. And think about it. Think about what these objects lived through and survived when all of these people who made them did not. So objects, unlike memories or stories, have a material presence. Memories, stories are verbal and abstract. Objects we can hold. And in this materiality of objects, they evoke in us their previous owners. They act in a way as stand-in for the person who once made them or used them or loved them. Family heirlooms are experienced by us as if by association they sort of soaked up traces of their previous owner and their being, the being of our ancestors that we never got to meet. And in many ways, objects, through their materiality, through the way they were made, the choice of, let's say, the choice of the blue thread, and only blue thread, on the white background of the tablecloth that my aunts, whom I never met, chose for the whole set of the nedunya that they were embroidering for my aunt, it tells us something about their taste, about their choice of material and of thread, about how they did it. Did they do a very careful job? Did they not do a careful job? Tells us some things about the choices that they made when they created the objects that we have and that we hold, when they chose to take them, to keep them, to hide them, or to transport them, as some people did. So touching what our grandmother or grandfather or aunts whom we never met once touched provides us with a very unique experience, a physical connection to the objects that they once touched. And touch is a very, very profound experience in our life. It's the first way through which a baby gets to know the world. Is the world a pleasant place? Is it not? It's a lot of what is communicated to a baby by the way that they're touched by the people that care for them. We continue to experience a lot of very important things via touch. And so touching the objects is a very, very powerful experience of unique connection with the people that touch those objects before us. And as I said, through the objects, through the shape, the color, the activities that they were part of, we actually feel as if we establish a certain connection to the people that had them before us. And the memory of these people is therefore changed in our minds from that of victims of the Holocaust to a much more personal, embodied memory of a real person who once lived a very real life and used these very real objects, these mundane or otherwise regular, ordinary objects in their lives. So sentimental objects that are associated with loss, as are all of the objects that come to us from before the Holocaust or during the Holocaust, sentimental objects associated with loss do not always generate only positive reactions, such as, happy, warm, favorable memories. It's not at all the same as looking at the tiny little shirt that our child wore when they were 3 years old, when all is well and the child is now a happy and healthy grown-up. The engagement with some sentimentally valuable objects, such as those that we are discussing right now, evokes often also very painful reactions. And that is, of course, particularly true in our families and in cases where such objects belong to someone that we loved who's deceased. It's important to mention here that the value of such objects that belong to our murdered family members and their lives before the war is far beyond their value just in commemorating these people. Because even if we now have the opportunity to erect a memorial that will commemorate them, we still have an attachment to the object. It will not take away from the importance of that object the fact that we now have a memorial to our family members, and we will still feel very sad if that object gets lost. So what is it really that we associate with these objects that belonged to our parents' lost homes, to our grandparents that we never got to know? I will put in here an experience that I had as a very young woman. I worked for the Israeli government, and I arrived in Germany where I ended up spending 4.5 years working for our Israeli government and doing my PhD. And when I arrived there, an apartment was rented for me on the top floor of a small house that belonged to an older lady. And on the evening when I arrived, I had never been outside really much, only once abroad before. And she invited me to her apartment, to her living room. She made me coffee, and she proudly showed me her china cabinet where she had all kinds of objects, like some china cups and saucers and some silver objects and some lace collar. And also next to it was standing a wooden loom that was used in her family generations before. And she told me that many of these objects go far back in her family history, all the way to her great-great-grandfather who did business with the Russian Tsar. And I remember standing there frozen, incredulous, in front of this china cabinet, looking at these objects that came down so many generations in an uninterrupted chain, continuous, uninterrupted chain in this family. And I was just overwhelmed with the sense of the long life of objects that just overwhelmed me in comparison to the absence of any such object in our own families, and the disrupted and broken continuity of the passing of objects in our family. And finally, in 1995, I actually went to Poland. Until then, it seemed to me that the Poland of my parents' life was erased from the face of the planet, as it perhaps, in my feeling, should have been. But it wasn't. It was a very real place in which very real people continued to live. And since it was very shortly after the Iron Curtain had just fallen, things in Poland were still very dilapidated. The houses and everything was still very, very much very close to the state of affairs right after World War II. And so people were very poor, and it was very clear that in that kind of poverty, the objects that once lived in my family's home were still being used in some household or households around in this town. And it was really startling to see clearly Jewish objects such as candlesticks and Chanukiot being peddled in the local flea markets. So, and of course, the magnificent synagogue where my grandfather used to pray was turned into a town library without any mention of its past. And so, in many, many ways, the long life of objects poignantly highlighted the absence of their rightful owners, the absence of the people whom I was so much longing for. And what I did, as many second generations shared with me having done similar things, I did purchase a coffee set in my parents' town, the image of which you see here. A coffee set that was, in a way, one could say, a simulation heirloom, an attempt at a simulated heirloom, something that was by nature, a coffee set like that was something very European, very much part of the way that my parents and their friends would have coffee, not so much part of the Sabra Israeli culture. It was a very German, Polish, Hungarian, Viennese kind of thing, Kaffee und Kuchen at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And it was as though this object from my parents' hometown could provide some sense of a continuity with a usable past, as I said before, beyond that rupture that erased every single object, everything from their lives, and the entire family that perished. Like many other 2Gs, I schlepped with me the entire service, as it was called, from Przemysl, in what one could say is a somewhat pathetic attempt to find that connection, that simulation of an heirloom or a connection to my family past. But what we are really trying to do by such efforts is to reclaim our family's possessions, or even through these replacement objects that are not exactly our families, but like what our family could have had. We're trying in a way to undo that part of the Nazi destruction, and that, of course, is an impossible task. However, the interest and the meaning of such objects for us, we have to remember, is a way of recapturing. They're like the objects are carriers of family history, of the history of a community, of a way of life that was destroyed for us and to which we have no other connection. The meaning and the importance, the salience of the objects can be very much something that changes for us throughout life. What could be completely meaningless to us when we were 16 years old or 26 years old can become a very meaningful object at a later point in life. And sometimes the change in the meaning of these objects as carriers of family history, sometimes that change occurs because of some significant life transition in the family, such as a birth or the death of one of the older survivors in the family. And that's why it is very important for me to always tell all of my patients and friends who are second generation to make sure that we mark these objects and that we tell their stories, and that we ask the people who are still, who carry still the actual memories associated with these objects to tell us these stories, so that we can put these stories in a way by passing them verbally or by writing them, so that they will be there when our child, perhaps the third generation, perhaps the fourth generation, at age 45, discovers their interest has intensified and now they want to know these stories. And many times in our families, the interest in the family history skips a generation, so to speak, because for the second generation, sometimes it was too painful to ask because of that double wall that I mentioned. For the survivors, it was too difficult and painful to talk. But sometimes survivors are more willing to talk about their past to the third or fourth generation, and sometimes for various reasons it's easier for those generations than it was for the second generation. And we have to make sure that the meaning of these objects is available to them, because the connection must be established for us by someone who knows about it. Otherwise, these objects are just objects. And worse than that, since we know that these are objects that belong to our destroyed families, to our murdered families, these objects without a story are primarily signifiers of destruction and of loss and of death. It's the story that is associated with them that makes them also part of a viable connection to people that lived before they were murdered, to the way they lived, to who they were, to how this object was used, to the homes in which they were used, and so forth. So again, as long as possible, ask the people who still carry the actual memories to tell us about them, and make sure that the stories are available to the next generations when they become interested in them. And if you are lucky enough to have photographs, make sure that you mark the names of the people on them and the stories that are associated with them. And if we're lucky, we have people who have survivors in our families, grandparents or others, who are still alive when we have our own children or grandchildren, who can point the similarities in their features, in their mannerisms, in their behavior to the people that lived before us. And that is really the truest form of continuity of our family line. And this is, again, from my own personal family, the only photograph that I have that remained of my father's family. It was sent to my aunt Binka, the eldest daughter, after she left home. And this is a very dear man who just passed away a few weeks ago in Israel. He was supposed to marry my youngest aunt. And when he escaped the ghetto with a bunch of young people, he begged her to go along with him, but she refused to leave her parents. And so she was murdered along with my grandparents. And this is Yoske, holding the same photograph. And what happened was that Yosuke had not seen me since I was a young child until I, at 19, came to visit him in Haifa. And I was in the apartment, and he opened the door and saw me. I was the same age as my aunt was when he last saw her, and when he saw me, he fainted. And obviously it was a very difficult moment for him, but it was in a curious way, a very good feeling for me to feel the power, the force of my resemblance to my aunt, the connection, the intensity of the connection to my aunt and to my family that I never met. And the other thing that I mentioned before is that because of the objects being associated with the violence with which they were robbed from our families, with the destruction of our family, the objects from the pre-Holocaust life of our families are often associated with very difficult feelings that go along with the ruthlessness with which they were robbed from their owners. And I have one such item from my mother's family. This is a tablecloth that I cherish very, very much. When my mother came back after the war to her home, it was occupied by a non-Jewish family, and the man who opened the door saw her. He picked up a big log of wood from the fireplace, and he threatened her and said, "If you come here again, I will kill you." But as he was standing at the door, my mother noticed the tablecloth from her mother's home on the table behind him. And it so happened that my mother knew someone who was in the police of the town at that time, and she came back with that man, and so she managed to take back this tablecloth from her home, and we have used this tablecloth on the dining room table throughout my growing up years on our birthdays in a very, very with a very special feeling. Another very special category of objects that I do want to mention is mementos from the Holocaust, not from before the Holocaust, not from the homes of our parents before the Holocaust, but from the Holocaust itself. And these objects were often hidden away in a box up in the closet or in the attic, in a place where the survivor never shared it with children or with grown-up children, and sometimes they are discovered only after the parent passed away. In such cases, of course, the story of the object and the story of why the parent kept it remains untold, and it's a very, very big loss. Documentation without the story leaves that object actually as a symbol or signifier of death and destruction. And the kind of memory work that we want to happen, the one that establishes connection with the people that lived before they were destroyed, before they were murdered, requires a story. It requires the story that connects these objects to the past, that connects it to something that is more than a signifier of trauma and traumatic loss. And that is important, especially with mementos of the Holocaust, especially when the story of the object is somehow related to symbols of hope, of resistance, of resilience, or help that was gotten, rather than just a symbol of the persecution. In such cases, where the story associated with the object is part of those positive experiences, it can provide a very important connection, a very important part of the legacy that the second and the third generation can hang on to, and it symbolizes that part of the legacy. And here is an example that I'm going to show you of some objects that were generously shared with me with the family of Israel Ira Lulinsky, who was a Holocaust survivor. And he kept in a old talit bag, hidden away for many, many years, this dress that belonged to his murdered sister that somehow a neighbor managed to get a hold of and save, and a talit that he got from the joint, they believe, in the DP camp right after the war and after liberation. These objects were hidden away and found very, very recently by his family. It was too difficult for him to look at these objects. It was too difficult for him to tell the story of the objects. And in fact, his daughter said to me, until today, I cannot touch this dress. It burns. And lastly, before we come to the conclusion of our talk today, I want to point out that there are some important differences in the meaning that is ascribed to these objects by survivors and by children of survivors or descendants of survivors, because survivors often have primarily negative feelings or painfully dismissive feelings about remnants of their pre-war lives. Survivors also often have a lessened attachment to objects in general, even objects in their post-war lives, maybe because so much was taken from them, so much that's more important than objects, that objects don't mean quite as much to them. The meaning of these objects for the second generation is very different. As I said, it's much more about connecting to something that we can feel related to, that establishes important elements in our identity, which we don't have any, or we have very few links connecting us to. For the survivors, these are just pale remnants of what they know they had and was destroyed. And another important difference for children of survivors who grew up in families that left Europe with a lot of objects before it was impossible, the feeling about these objects is very different, naturally, than in our families, where one single cup or one single rolling pin or one single tablecloth is everything we have. And one of the things that makes a big difference about how second generation feel about these objects, when they have a lot of them, depends on where they grew up. So, for example, growing up in Israel, at the time when I was growing up, everybody wanted to just be a Sabra, very Israeli, leave everything that had to do with the diaspora behind, not have any connection to it when we were very young. And everybody wanted our homes to be very Israeli and not Polish or Hungarian or whatever. And so these objects that belong to the old world were not something we had a very positive feeling about when we were very young. In other places, the feelings might have been very different about it. For example, for some second generation growing up in England, it was a different environment in which the connection to family legacy and to heirlooms was very different. So that's another element that we have to remember in terms of how we feel about it. And Assman coined the term the memory of things. Things tell stories. They tell stories from the intimate realm to the public realm and act as carriers of our personal and cultural memory. And in many ways, objects, as opposed to memories and stories, are part of that past. In their very material being, they are physical part of the past, while being right now in the present, in our hand or in our home. And in that sense, they are a very unique sort of physical bridge to the past that they were literally part of. And in that sense, objects in their unique materiality allow the distance in time between then and now to be a certain, to be condensed, to be bridged, to be connected. And they also, in many ways, connect there and here. When I hold the tablecloth that was embroidered by my aunt that I never met in Poland, and I'm holding that tablecloth now in my home in New York after it was taken by my aunt to her homes in Austria, in Palestine, and in New York. You know, these elements, these objects provide us with a bridge through time and through different continents. I thank you very much for the pleasure and the honor of being part of this conference, and wish you all be well, be safe, and thank you.